Hi guys, welcome back to part 2 of the architectural design demo. So we're going to be focusing on refinement today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take, let's say, 3 of our thumbnails. All right, so these are the thumbnails that we designed in our previous demo. And what we're going to do is we're going to take those and start to refine them. So when we talk about refining, it's not so much, it's not just cleaning up. It's about resolving design problems. So these resolving in terms of resolving design problems, it's not just the look of things. It's not just the finish of things. You're looking at things like, let's say scale. We're trying to fix a scale. We're also looking at proportions. We're looking at set dressing. Right, so we're looking at these key issues. We're starting to work out, okay, we have our design sort of from a macro level, roughly what it's going to look like. Now, if we were to take a step closer, if we were to take one step closer and look at it at a slightly larger scale, what do we need to resolve? So obviously, the scale in terms of making sure that it's big enough, the door frames are big enough for a person to walk through, the proportions so that the door frame or the building itself doesn't look too weird, set dressing, things like barrels, it could be even some larger things like signage. Those things start to go into sort of resolving these, because what all this is going to do, it's just going to help sell our idea or sell our design. Right? Effectively, we're trying to communicate more information into it. So let's say if we were to do one building through scale, proportion, and set dressing, we can start to make that building appear as though it was owned and operated by someone who's very poor or very rich. We can also start to include elements like the environment, right? So that would be where this area, it could be very cold, it could be very warm, right? All sorts of things. Now we already have the global view of the culture as well, but this is also where we can narrow it down into specifically, let's say, in this case, we've got sort of we're dealing with feudal Japan, but we could break it down into an area. Oops. So it could be that this is more of a nautical themed feudal Japan. This is more of an inland or mountain sort of area. So this is what goes into when we're refining a design. It is, of course, all of this is also going to have a level of cleanup. Right? And the cleanup is not having that perfect line that runs through. It's not having really clean lines. What this really means is clarity. So clarity of design. How easy is it for our audience to understand what we're trying to sell? In the context, if you want to think about it, in the context of work, while you're moving along, your design has to get approved at certain stages by different people, right? So they might have a rough idea to begin with, then they might start to narrow it down because other elements like game design or the budget or certain other details might come through, and that's going to slowly take your design across this through this process. So you want to make sure that at each level that the clarity of the design is very clear in terms of it's very easy to understand what you're trying to design. It's very easy to understand what you're trying to, the messaging that you're trying to get across to your audience. So when we're dealing with cleanup, or when we talk about cleanup, it's not necessarily having the perfect line. It's not necessarily having these beautifully drawn images. It's really about how clear is your design? How easy is it to understand? And so when we make that translation from thumbnails to a refined drawing or refined design, and then finally into a finished piece, we're always thinking about clarity of design. How clear and easy is this to understand? And so in this particular section that we're at now, in terms of refinement, we're looking at scale, we're looking at proportion, we're looking at set dressing. And through the combination of these, we begin to sell our design. It could be very poor, could be very rich, could be cold, could be warm, could be a particular area, like I said before, maritime or in the mountains and so forth. And this is also when we can start to indicate materials as well, since materials are going to influence the area as well as the environment and the resources available to whoever's running this place, whether they're rich and poor. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to resolve these design problems, right? So that we're ensuring that as we get closer to our design, as we take one step closer, we establish this clarity of design. We get a better understanding for it. Now, what we're going to do is, pulling back, I've selected 3 designs from our previous demo. So here is our blacksmith, we have our stable, and we have our archery range. What I've done here is I've just quickly gone across and I've just mapped these out in a bit more of with more perspective. Now, the way I created these is using a perspective grid that I've created, so you can kind of see where some of my vanishing points are on this. Some of them, particularly generally, I like to keep my images where one side of the vanishing point is a little closer than the other side. So this one goes a little bit further out. This one definitely goes quite a fair way out on this side. But you can see the previous demos I've done for the foundation group, and I'll talk about how to create a perspective grid. But it's pretty easy. All you essentially need to do is create your horizon line, choose where you want to establish your vanishing points. And in the case how I created mine, I simply used the line tool and just create a line out, and then start to move this guy around either as a digital ruler to ensure my perspective, or I could create multiple of these, select them, and then simply stroke them to get a grid running across. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward to make. But like I said, I've gone ahead and I've kind of created sort of a more cleaned up perspective version of these buildings so that I have something to work off. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go in and start to fiddle around and try and get the core idea from up here to match this sort of new perspective shot. Because what we see here, it's a flat side view, no perspective, right? So we're really just looking at the big shapes. Now, with a little bit more perspective, we want to bring in, like I wrote about before, things like scale, proportion, and set dressing. And this is where we're able to kind of deal with that. All right, so here I've got the rough cleanup. Shouldn't say cleanup, but a rough sort of plotting of our original design up here. Let me just switch to red. So this was from our previous demo with the rough thumbnail, and here I've created a very quick and a very rough sort of image plotted out in perspective. Now I've kind of jumped this particular element because this is, one, it's very boring if you want to watch me carefully kind of mirror everything across and plot things, and two, this material is freely available on quite a number of other previous foundation demos as well. So I didn't want to waste too much time covering things that have already been covered before. Now, like I said earlier, this was all done using a perspective grid. If you know a little bit about 3D, so if you want to use a little bit of Blender, if you want to use a little bit of SketchUp or Maya, whatever it is that you're comfortable using to kind of block things down and check for proportions, then by all means, that's not a bad idea. At the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to use the tools that you're familiar with, the tools that you're most comfortable with to go ahead and generate this. It doesn't really matter how clean it is. All that really matters is getting this into a pretty nice perspective, right? So that we have something to work with. And that way, because I have this base, I don't have to stress too much about other things. I don't have to, while I'm designing this, while I'm cleaning this up, resolving any design issues, I'm not having to worry, or I'm not having to stress about checking if my vanishing points are correct. I still leave a lot of these sort of artifacts around, just so that if I need to reverse engineer my perspective lines, it's quite easy for me to do that. So all I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to drop my opacity, right? Because again, I don't want this to dominate too much. And from here, what I'm going to do is just simply start sketching out the overall shape and feel of my design, and try and resolve some of these things. Last time in the previous video I talked about this spine, trying to get it to look a little bit more horse-like or like a samurai. So we're going to try to work that in on a much larger scale so that we're going to see if some of these ideas work. And the idea is that we still keep it fairly rough, but keep in mind, rough, right, when you're doing things rough, it does not mean dirty, right? So when I'm talking about, okay, we're going to do a rough sort of plotting over this, it doesn't mean that we kind of scribble all over the place and we can't read anything. All rough means is that it's loose, right? It's loose, but it's still readable. You still have to be able to read it. And again, we go back to that core element that I talked about before, is really all of this is about clarity of design. How easy is it for someone looking at this to come in, someone who's never seen this before, for them to understand what's going on? If I go in and I detail every single thing, let's say there's tiles here and I draw every single tile and so on, that might be a really, artistically very beautiful, but it might create a level of density and so much noise that in terms of clarity, it kills it. So we're after clarity in terms of design. We're not, when we're going about doing our work, yes, we would like some artistic elements to come through. We obviously don't want to suppress our creative needs, but at the same time, we want to ensure that our primary goal, our primary directive is readability, right? Clarity of design. How easy is it for someone coming in cold to read our intentions, to understand the shape or the design or the thing that we've gone ahead and created? So let's go and start sketching this out. So I've dropped the opacity on my initial drawing back. And so now what I really am looking to do is I'm going to adjust my brush first. And we're going through and we're just going to start sketching out some of the things that we talked about wanting to do in our previous version. So this part kind of stays the same. Because these thatched roofs, they kind of look like giant chunks of toast. By the way, I have my reference images sitting on my second monitor, and they're the same reference images that I was using in part one of this demo. So those images haven't gone anywhere. We created them. We took the time to create them in our first step. So we want to keep holding on to them when we're designing. We chose them for a reason. So it is. So I can use this base, and that means that I don't have to think too much about it, because that base is already there. It's already got the perspective in it. I don't have to waste any energy kind of trying to figure out, where certain things are going. All I need to think about now is just kind of controlling the size, the scale, the proportions of things a little better. Because I could decide that, let's say, I don't want it this narrow, I want to push it out a little bit more. This is the part where I can do that. And because I have that skeleton underneath, I don't have to worry too much about it. I don't have to replot it out or do anything like that. I can kind of just use that as a base. And if I remember, I had this sort of spine that I wanted, so it's a little higher, let's say over here. And it cuts down there. So I can increase that. Still keep that little sort of bushy top that they have, but let's try and do it where maybe that shape, it's almost like the mane of the horse that we're creating. So again, really, sort of basic rudimentary shapes. And I'm working on the top first because that's going to give us a really nice profile to start with. I don't want to worry too much about the other parts, because at the end of the day, it's the top, this profile is really going to help sell a lot of this design. Okay. And then we're going to use the details at the bottom to kind of hammer it home. Now there's this sort of saddle-like structure there. So maybe I don't want... Originally when I plotted this out, I had it at a slight angle, sort of thinking that this might slope down. But if I want to stay with that sort of saddle, actually it makes my job a little bit easier. So if we, let's say, plot it to the middle, it's going to be about there. Again, so I'm still using a lot of my sort of these remaining perspective lines to help gauge where the midpoint of this is. So the bend should happen somewhere along here if I want a nice sort of even bend. In fact, I can use this point and then just follow these lines up. I pretend it's going to link back there. Now, personally, I like working with sort of a more oblong, more sort of oval-like brush, just because it gives me kind of a little bit of controlled chaos. It reminds me a little bit more as if I'm sketching on paper with a pen, as opposed to working digitally. Because sometimes, at least for myself, I find that transition from sketching on paper into sketching digitally, I find that a little bit difficult. I'm still used to that feedback and the messiness that you get from just working with pen, because ink can be a little bit messy, so can pencils, right? So graphite, you smudge things. And so I'm still used to working with those sort of mediums, and as a result, I try to replicate them where I can. And we've obviously got our sort of wooden supports coming down. And this is really just all about taking our small idea, or our, shall we say, our larger idea, and putting it in a context where we're able to show a little bit more detail. We might find that certain things are going to work and certain things may actually not work at all. So what I might want to do is, for example, I think I want to make sure that this roof is a lot thicker than the roofs back here. So even though my original construction is about this wide, I'm just going to increase that. And we're keeping things fairly loose, but again, loose is still has to be readable. But we're keeping things fairly loose so that we're not too locked down in terms of any particular design element. We can still change a lot of things. Let me see. Let me get these parts of the roof done as well. I got this segmented part, so I might start to cut into this. So the segmented part actually sits a little bit more like this. So it's kind of overlapping a little. We'll do it for this part down here as well. Oh, I'm starting to lose a little bit of my perspective. Let's key it in again. So part of the reason why I'm doing this part is I want to have enough of an offset so I understand how I can go about designing this particular roof on this end. So we can try to get this sort of shape. Now I'm going to go in and resolve this part later in terms of how this actually overlaps. But you can see right now what I'm trying to mimic is that the armored plates of samurai, where it's kind of the lacquered plates that overlap, like a lobster plate. I'm also constantly looking back up. If you occasionally see kind of where I pause a little, where I'm not doing anything, or if I go a little bit quiet, it's because I'm looking back up to my reference images and I'm trying to see how they go about resolving or creating certain shapes. For example, I have this roof coming down and I want to join it with a protrusion on this side. How would, visually, how would they have gone about doing that? So a lot of the roofs it's not just a straight angle down. A lot of them, because of the weight of the material, they're going to curve. So we're just going to start to introduce some of those curves. And I want those curves to be more prominent on my larger sections. So the shorter sections, if it's quite short, they'll be nice and straight. If it's longer, they're going to have a little bit more of that pronounced curve, just to show there's a bit more weight running along them. Section coming up here. Now I'll keep my architectural styles. I want to try and keep them as consistent as I can. I don't want to follow too much precisely of the references that I have. I'm using them as a solid base to understand how these things fit together. But I don't want to follow them to the T, because we still want a level of fantasy. We still want a level of sort of, I guess, fantasy to come into these designs. Because we are designing something for entertainment. We don't want to. If we were simply creating something that we could get from a sort of a textbook, or we could find it on Google, then it's not particularly interesting. Now, don't get me wrong. There are times where that's necessary. In fact, there's a lot of times when that might be necessary. Whether it's because the game or the product that you're working on is historical, or it's because you are learning. And when we're learning, we want to minimize the amount of variables that we can. So this is where real life references can be quite useful. But for most of the time in entertainment, we do want to create something that people, where it has a little bit more fantasy to it. We consume entertainment because we're trying to get away from real life. We're trying to not have to deal with, at least temporarily, some of the I guess the day-to-day minutia of just having to go about our lives, paying taxes and doing your bills, that sort of stuff. Let's double check this. Okay, so I had my original top section follow my perspective. So that means that I need the other part to do the same, or the other half to do the same. Now I have this, there's a lot of curvature for a lot of these along the spine, whether it's natural like this or artificial like this. So I want to try and preserve some of that as well. So since this is coming on a downward slope, I want to mimic something that's a little bit more opposite, and try and call back to that particular section. And again, we're dealing with natural fibers, so it's perfectly reasonable that it's not going to be perfect. Now, in my original sketch, this particular roof section at the back was a little bit different. It was going to be tiled as opposed to thatched. So its structure is going to be a little bit different. Its structure is going to be, well, it could be made out of wooden slats. What I thought would be kind of cool to mimic when you have sort of a horse and they might drape some armor over it, I thought it'd be quite nice based off on the reference images I had, was that the top section is made out of thatch. It's a slightly different thatched roof. And it's going to come down, and then the bottom section is going to go over. It's going to go over the tiles. So I'm trying to create this layered effect. So let's drop this down a little bit lower because it's starting to get a bit of a samey feeling over here. But let's say over here is when we start to introduce our tiled roof. And we're just kind of hinting at it over here. Doesn't mean to be too explicit. As we get a variation of sort of not only materials but a style, so it doesn't become too boring. Just going to remind myself, putting in little sections up here, ventilation. So we've kind of got the top sort of down. For now, we're always free to go back and change it. There's that little curve that's there that I think is quite interesting. So I might just go in and just kind of reinforce that a little bit, just as a reminder to myself later on when I come in to really clean it up, that I keep that, I try and somehow maintain that curvature. Falls back there, so it starts about there. Now, these roofs are not running flush with the wall. There's a little bit of an offset cutting in on the inside. So I want that same to apply. Still going to connect roughly across there. And we have our original sort of this sign sitting somewhere there, but we'll deal with it in a little while. Let me just erase this. Now, I have these pillars that are running up, so now I want to have a look at how the architecture in Japan might go about doing it. So the architecture in China that you see often is a lot of sort of these really grand cylindrical pillars that go up. But if you match it, even though there's a lot of similarities between Japanese and Chinese cultural architecture, there's certainly a lot of differences as well. And so for the references I'm looking at right now that we're using, if the building is a little bit more rustic, you do get sort of half logs being used, where it's just kind of split down the middle. But in most cases, they're kind of being milled and machined so that you're dealing with very angular surfaces. That's probably one of the main things that separates out Japanese architecture from Chinese architecture of a roughly similar period, is that there's a lot more angularity to it. But compared to sort of European design, it's definitely not as angular. The wall, this is the roof. We have the wall of the building here. I want a little bit of a sort of a dip. So from the side, it kind of cuts in a little bit and comes down before we have our support beams. And so I'm looking at some of the temples, shrines that the Japanese have in this particular moment in time, and they are quite sort of blocky in their supports. I'm just going to mimic that because these are our main sort of pillar supports. But what they do have though is they have a lot of really nice wood carving. So these friction joints along the top of these supports. And they've also got, if we use our perspective line, there we go. And they also have these really nice sort of cross beams that are there to kind of help support or to create more support for the structure. In terms of, they almost act like as keys, but they get repurposed sometimes to fulfill a secondary function, which is something a little bit more decorative. Something like this. There might be patterns. Now we're focusing on forms. We don't want to focus on the so the carvings too much. Again, we're looking at sort of, I guess at this stage, our second level details or our second level forms. So there might be some more friction joint detailing up here to kind of support this area. We might decide that we may want to cut this to create a little bit more space, a little bit more of an airy feel. Supports running down. And this one may run across like this. And this might be inside here where we put the entrance to the stables. Now we don't need this to be perfect in terms of alignment. We are dealing with, sort of a more rustic sort of look. But overall, we just need to make sure that most of the perspective lines up. Now again, we can look at a couple of details. So right now, if this is kind of, there might be an entrance here, our person might be, let's say, about this tall. So a horse, given the size of a horse, might be about this high. So we just want to make sure that there's enough clearance for the horse to duck its head underneath and get into the stables here. And also, if I want to have a barn door on this side, something a little bit less ornate, that we get that same height as well in terms of clearance, so that the horse can kind of actually be able to make its way inside. Now since we have the scale of the person, we can start to position in some windows up here. Now in this case, I want a relatively small window. So there's my midpoint, rough based off this. So if it comes down, it should be about there. So I just want a small sort of window. Keep to the idea of large, medium, and small. So in terms of how I might partition the window. And so there's a lot of use of rice paper. So there's a lot of smaller supports in. And very similar to European architecture, we have this sort of lattice-like sort of timber support that we can see that frames a lot of things. again, if we think about that's going to be my large, so then I probably want, let's see if I have any ideas from my design up here. Not necessarily. Then we might create our small. Again, just referring back. Small, and then our medium over here. And this can be subdivided just to give it a bit more teeth, or a bit more sort of material to work with. All right, so we're starting to get across a pretty nice, accurate representation of our initial thumbnail sketch. Again, this is the first pass that we're really doing. Let me just move our little guy to the side. And ultimately, we're going to be making a couple of these passes. Make sure that there's a little gap there because it doesn't quite meet the edge of that wall. It's a separate protrusion by itself. Again, we always want to make sure that we calculate, or at least provide enough of a tolerance for this, the fact that our roof actually pokes out a little bit more. Again, I'm looking back at my reference images and I'm looking at how I might make this particular section a little bit more interesting. There wasn't much design when I did it. It was kind of just a flat section. So now we're thinking, well, what could we possibly do to make this a little bit more interesting? So we could, let's say, merge a little bit of this roof into or under the roof for this side. So it kind of overlaps in terms of thatching. Put down some vertical braces to support the edges, and that's probably going to push out a little bit. There might be a skirting board at the bottom that might run across the bottom of most of the structure. We've also got these sort of support beams that come out on the side. Let's keep these relatively close together, or evenly separated, sorry. You can probably see a little bit of just that one poking out the other side. Now, every building, every character, every vehicle, every prop that we design is always going to have a particular face. And it's nice to be able to settle down on, or get that sort of face figured out first. Now in this case, this face could be either here or it could be over here. For argument's sake right now, I'm going to determine the face to be on this side, just temporarily at least. That way, as I'm designing this vehicle, or sorry, as I'm designing this building, I at least have tentatively a point that I could use. There. So I might decide later on that this is not actually the section that I'm after, and I'm always free to change that. But for now, this just gives me a point of origin that I can work with, or at least work around temporarily. Otherwise, it feels very strange to not have a central focal point. So we have that signage that we have attached down. little lanterns. Just to break up this surface a little, again, I'm looking at a lot of my reference images. They often have these sort of ventilation sections that kind of pop out. And that just breaks up that surface a little bit. Otherwise, right now, it's kind of just like, blup, and it's just this flat thing that kind of sits there. I decide that I want these to reach down a little bit more, just to again, push that large, medium, and small. We don't want things that are too even. Things that are too even have a tendency to become very stale. Again, constantly referring back to my reference images. And let's say for the stable, there's no real arches with Japanese doors, so to speak. Most of them, the design seems to be quite rectangular. So if, let's say, we have sort of a stable door over here, might be a support that runs across. And maybe as far as the door is concerned, it's actually thin strips of fabric, almost like a fly screen sort of effect. Break that up a little bit so that goes inside. And again, looking at, they might want, that might be it. There's a nice pattern in some of these buildings where they have sort of this diamond or this knot shape they put in the middle of their supports. And there's vertical supports. And it creates a nice texture. So the surface is not kind of just this flat sort of element here. Again, what we also want to try and do where possible is we do want to open up the space. When you open up a space, it makes it feel a lot more three-dimensional than if you closed off every single door. If you close off every single door, it has a tendency then to feel a little bit flat, a little bit plain. Maybe here there might be a little awning. A lot of this stuff is kind of made out of just wooden panels. Gotta remember that my center line is actually a little further behind than where I drew them because of the offset from the roof itself. Maybe along here there might be some notices, but these are starting to get into the very tiny details that I don't want to worry myself with too much, not at this stage. Also, there's another door that kind of leads inside. I have sort of a shed-like element over here. In terms of this, we can also, again, apply the tiles. In this case, we could also change it where it's more sort of made out of natural materials rather than something like porcelain or terracotta. Maybe it's bamboo. Alright, so again, we get a change in materials, and that can be quite nice. structure underneath. So I'm kind of sounding out the ideas that are running through my head, and sometimes, you know, they might work, sometimes they're not going to work. But the only way for us to really know is if we, you know, we have to try them. If we don't try them, then we have no idea whether they're actually going to work or not, whether they're going to be interesting ideas or very boring ideas. We want to avoid, where possible, this process where we're dismissing things because we don't want to try anything. So cutting back, now let's have a look. How does this line look? It's quite a shallow line back to the vanishing point. So maybe over here we might have a post, and that could be a wall, so a small partition to kind of gate off horses or things like that. And when you think about this main door, what we could do to this main door, so let's take a page out from some Japanese shrines. They have these giant, sort of very cool looking doors with those heavily sort of embossed openings. I can say that this whole section up here up to there is maybe hollow underneath. So we could, let's say this is the midpoint. So the midpoint, and you open up the door. Door's going to be about there. Be a lock mechanism in here. Again, looking back at my reference images, I'm just trying to get an idea of some of the patterns that some of these doors might have used. I've got some really interesting sort of patterns on these. It's very geometric. Medallion. Maybe this is embossed or sort of, or capped with these little medallions over here. And so open this up, and we can decide to open the other side up as well if we want. So we can decide to open it and show the inside of the actual door. All right, so let's say this is the, be about there is the hinge point, so we can open it out. Sure, maybe inside there's really thick supports to kind of bear the weight of everything along with the doors. But this will give us a nice idea what the back of the door is going to look like. Maybe it's just very simple with a handle to kind of pull or close it. And if we match this side out, we can start to put in some walls, and we can hint at a couple of maybe stables inside. Again, we always want to try, at least in my opinion, we always want to try and open and close spaces. Now I just realized we have these beams running across, so I don't want my door to be opened up too wide, because then it's going to crash right into that beam and, you know, pretty much snap it. I'm thinking about divisions of my space. A lot of natural materials used with Japanese architecture, a lot of timber. Because it's really nice sort of, you get a very flat facade, but it's also rich in a lot of sort of design details. darken this just so I know that it's a separate wall. It's more of a note for myself. And we might have these very tall sort of banner poles coming up. Maybe on this side we might actually purposely just kind of put them on these on a slight angle. Just a little bit of weight, a little bit of gravity. Don't want things to be too perfect. As it comes through. Again, back section representing the tail. We're not really going to see too much of it. Just maybe some smaller banners here. And of course I put in a little shed over here, or I guess a couple of more stables over here, just to kind of round off this design. Otherwise it kind of tails off. It's a bit weak on the tail end, no pun intended, because it kind of slopes down here. So I thought I just want to give a bit more weight on this side with this sort of with this shed here. But before I get there, now that we have the base geometry done, so dare I say this would be in this particular refinement stage, this would be, let's say, step 1. What we want to do now is step 2. So let's say step 1 is the geometry. We now want to focus on step 2. And step 2 is going to be on integration. So what I mean by integration is not so much, oh, we're going to integrate things like onto this, stick things here and there and so on. What I mean by integration is, how do I embed this into an actual ground so it doesn't look like sort of this weird floating prop. So this is where we start to talk about transitions. So we're looking at transition from one shape, in this sense, the ground plane, into another shape, which is a pillar or a door or a building. So we want to make sure that that movement from this surface, let's say in this case this horizontal surface, to this vertical surface is nice and smooth, right? So there's a grace and there's a flow to it. So we don't want something where it's just like blop, blop, like this. We want something, let's say, we start to add in a bit of dirt on the side. Maybe there's some broken things here. It could be that on the side here, to show that it's really dealing with horses, we might have bundles of hay. Now right now I don't actually have any references of bundles of hay, of how they would have stored it in sort of feudal Japan. So I'm just going to put these in as a temporary placeholder, and then I'm going to go look up how they might store it. Now I might just end up that, you know, things are stored however they're stored, like they're just thrown onto the ground or in a pile. But what I'm looking at now, and then I'll put that in, but what I'm looking at now is I'm trying to think, okay, how do I make this look real? I'm just going to double check, I think. Oh, that's actually, yeah. I thought that was a little bit off, but apparently not. Because this is a little off from the perspective. So things like this start to help, and it could be, okay, maybe there's a board over here, just to, you know, say what they're supposed to be doing today. Maybe a task list that the stable hands need to follow. Again, the ever useful barrels, or in this case, you know, we'll say Japanese barrels, are a little bit squatter. Doesn't quite have the height of European barrels, but they're often wrapped and they've got this really beautiful knotwork around them. Things like this. And what we're doing is we're adding things so that, yeah, that transition from one element to another is not that severe. And that can also apply to elements such as the roof here. I've got one roof coming out this direction. I've got another roof coming down here. So they're going to collide there. Rather than just sort of doing something where it's like this, where it's kind of very, very boring, we want to start thinking, okay, well, this is a natural material, so this is probably going to flow into this section here, leaving a little bit of shadow coming through. Right. Maybe as part of that section, that roof, there needs to be a support running in here. So we might be able to see, let's say, some remnants of the horizontal supports kind of poking out here to give an idea that they're supporting something underneath. Again, just like over here, and we can use these elements to help show how these roofs actually sit. Right, and so this is all about step 2, right? Integration or transition. So we want that smooth shift. We want to avoid where we have these very clear, very jarring sort of divisions, because then it seems very strange. It looks very amateurish when you just have one object kind of colliding with another one. Let's say in this case, like adding this to this, you don't want to just collide them together, because the result is going to look like something that's very raw, it's very rough, it's not going to look manufactured, it's not going to look like it could exist in the real world, or something that someone has built. Start to put in maybe over here, there might be some wooden planks placed on the ground just to kind of help the horses kind of lose a bit of mud that they might track in. So if they need to repair any horseshoes, it becomes a little easier. Other things kind of creating this transition. So like I said, the transition is not necessarily just on the ground, but it's also up here. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to resolve a lot of these elements. So here, what I kind of thought would be interesting is there's this sort of nice pattern with sort of some Japanese textile detailing. So what I want to try and do here is mimic that by creating sort of almost like these wooden side panels that go in to support it. Since this is the face of the building, they might be inclined to spend a little bit more money to kind of get these planks or these side elements in. We'll use that to create sort of our shapes. I might show you a little bit of the thatching kind of come through, and then we can show that they're being supported by sort of these cross beams. That might poke out a little bit just to change the form a little bit so it's not so bland. And then we can also put a little bit of a small roof. Again, looking back at my reference images, maybe something just to support it back here. Maybe this gets anchored over here so it doesn't fall down and hit someone. Maybe little banners over here. Let's have a look at this. So this we want to keep relatively simple as well. I'm just going through placing sort of this, using this sort of thatched material. It's a little bit shallower, so I guess it can, has a bit more stiffness to it.
I do like this material because I'm going to put a slight curve on this. I do like this material, like I said. It kind of makes make the roofs look like giant sort of pieces of bread or toast. It's kind of nice, and it's very welcoming. I feel that visually it's very welcoming. Well, it's very soft. It doesn't feel very intimidating. Now, so this is going to be an exposed building. Then that gives us the opportunity as well to show a bit more of the skeleton underneath. So if we were to strip the walls off, what would this kind of look like? Might be a whole lot of supports, cross beams running through. Definitely want to put sort of a support beam over here. We don't really need to go in and make sure that every sort of joint is a true sort of friction joint, but we just want to add in enough information that we can kind of get away with, get away as a cursory glance that people kind of think, oh, okay, it's a friction joint. Our job at the end of the day as well, we're not really meant to be architects. We're just trying to make things kind of believable. Buckets, wooden boards, things like that. Again, just to help with transition. So we never want just kind of like a flat sort of blob. Even something like grass on around the edges, that can help really ground a design. Oh, didn't want to move that around. And sometimes it could even be, could just be some tools propped along the side. So little things like that can really help sell the believability of something. Let me move this up. So now that I have this as a rough, sort of roughly laid out, the third step, step number 3, I just realized I kind of messed up my numbering here. There we go. So step number 3 at this point is we're gonna just start to go for a light cleanup. Everything here is very bold. Everything here is a little bit grainy. So what I want to do is I want to zoom in a little bit more and start to just tidy up a couple of things, resolve a couple of sections, because you can see as I zoom in, it gets a little bit dirty, right? It gets a little bit messy. When we zoom out, it looks kind of nice as a sketch, but we're dealing with a refinement phase. So we want to now zoom in and we want to start to tidy things up where I might, drop my brush a little bit more. So the way that I go about doing this
is that I go in and I drop, first of all, is I create a new layer. Right. You don't have to follow this process. So you create a new layer, or you can use the original one that you had, like duplicate it, and then we drop the opacity of the original, and then we draw over. And what we're looking for at every single stage is clarity. Can I make this more clear? Can I make this easier to understand? Can I, for example, really make sure that people understand that this is a wooden board that's going over a thatched roof? Can I make people understand that this is a lantern, right? Like the people, when they look at it, they understand that this is a lantern with, some form of script on it. Maybe it's hung up, something like this, so that they don't misread this as being something else. So that's what we're going. That's what we'll be doing as our next step. Now, in the next step, the audio is going to be off. I'm going to speed it up a little bit, and you'll see me go through and clean this image up. And we're going to repeat this process for both the smith and the archery building as well. Alright guys, so here you can see is a more refined version of what we had before. So here's our original drawing, right, our original sketch. Let me separate out our notes from it so we can keep making our notes. There we go. So here's our first pass, as it were. So we're taking our original thumbnail, we're translating it to a slightly larger drawing. It's still quite rough, but we're getting a better idea of what's going on. And then after this, we have a more refined version. So if you were to think about, as I mentioned earlier, let's drag this guy up so that becomes what we're making our notes. So as you can see before, we've gotten to step 3, which is a very light cleanup. And what I'm trying to do is create more clarity. And you can see now we're getting a better idea of the materials that are being used. We're getting a better idea of the transition from our vertical surface to our horizontal surface. We're starting to get in a little bit more detail as well in terms of some of the materials, as I mentioned, the materials, but we're trying to reinforce some of the shapes that we have. Now, if I zoom in, of course, a lot of this is still not 100% resolved just yet. But from this point, we have a pretty good idea whether our design is going to work or not, or if there's any changes that we need to do. So typically at this point, what I do is I create a new layer, and using sort of a big fat red brush, kind of just like being back in school, I'm going to go through and start to work out what works and what doesn't work. So for example, this side stable here doesn't quite work for me right now because it doesn't have the same shape as the others. So I could decide that what I want to do is I want to raise the roof a little bit, bring that down, same thing as the other roofs across, and I might decide to put in that saddle motif to keep that running across. And that saddle motif is also trying to mimic that crest that we see sort of on samurai helmets as well. So we're trying to get that sort of idea in there. I might decide to bring this out a little bit more so it cuts in here, so we get some nice overlay. I might decide that there might need to be sort of an awning here, or maybe rather than an awning, maybe another sort of 3 vertical signs that can help break up this surface. Maybe hang them a little bit lower. Right, start to create a couple of elements, or in fact we could keep this kind of as it is now. We could extend this out a couple of bars, and then from here we can hang some saddles, and again, maybe this will come out here, and maybe there's a trough inside here for horses. Again, this is a stable, so they might have horses and things here. I might add a couple of other things, so maybe along here as well we have a trough. And so adding little things like this start to help kind of put this whole image together, and more importantly is I'm trying to link these two elements together so that we know it's a single element. So if I have some of these tools here, I could also lean a couple of other tools here, or maybe some weapons for the samurai on horseback over here as well. And you see how this creates kind of like a V shape, and that's going to start to link in these two elements. If we simply just had this gap where it was a vertical and a vertical, it's very clear that they're two different elements. But if we start to bring in elements or lines that start to get them pretty close on an angle, we start to view these as being connected to each other. So maybe out here what we have is we could place in maybe a weapons rack, and we make sure that the weapons that we have are uniquely cavalry based weapons. We can also have elements back here, let's say more sort of banners of whatever faction that this building is going to belong to, and that can help take up some of this space, right, and make them a little bit more linked together. So at this stage, I'll take this and then I would go back and then I kind of incorporate it into this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then what we'll go going forward from here is we'll go through the exact same process for our archery building and then for our blacksmith building as well. So the process really doesn't change. And again, everything I'm doing, it's focused around clarity. How clear, how easy can I make this be understood by someone coming in and looking at this for the first time? How easy is it for people to understand the idea that I'm going for? And design is always a constant back and forth process. It's not one thing after another. You're always having to go back, reassess, edit things, and so on. So we might finish the other two, come back, and we might edit this all together. We might decide that, maybe this part, we want to cut out this central section so it's much narrower, right? Maybe this is too long right now, and we want a bit narrower. Maybe we want to cut this a little bit shorter, or maybe we want to extend this so it runs out this way as well. Right, so all sorts of things. So really at the end of the day, that's what design is about. Going back and reassessing things, making sure that, okay, is the current version that I have clear? If it's not, what do I need to do to make it, to actually make it understandable? What do I need to do to make it more clear? What do I need to edit? What do I need to remove? And what do I need to add? All right, so for now, we're going to leave this as is. I'm going to jump back to this a little later on, and we're going to dive straight into the same process for our archery and smith buildings now. All right, so here is our archery building. So again, we're using the same process as we did before. We're just going through and we're starting to block out roughly what the shapes need to be. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit because again, I want to focus on the basic of the geometry first. So we know that's a center line coming down. So again, we're just following the shapes that I have. So again, I'm looking at the reference images that I created. We always want to be referring back to these. They're probably the most useful thing that you're going to have. So let's drop down to the roof. Make this a bit larger. And so they've got this kind of this blocky sort of section that comes out. That sprays out into the actual thickness of the roof. Again, I want these to be nice and thick. It's got a nice friendly sort of approach to it. Maybe not as thick as what I had before. Something like this. Let's see, this is coming down a little bit below there. Trying to be, where possible, as consistent as I can. Now obviously we're going to go through and we're going to clean this up later on, but the more that we can anchor down here, and the more that we can make sure it's correct here, the easier it is later on when we have to clean this up. Right? We don't have to figure as much stuff out at that point. Now I want to follow some design cues that I had from my stable. I want to make sure that these appear as they're in the same faction. So I'm going to put in a little bit of a sort of not necessarily a lip, but maybe a change in angle. A little bit of this kind of pokes out at a slightly different angle, so you get a bit of a shape variation. Now, I'm still not sure how this is going to end up, how this might look in the end, in terms of how we might transition from one form to the other. But that's where, we can figure that out when we're cleaning this up a little. For now, I'm just trying to get the basic geometry down. Also, another basic, the big geometry elements down. And then as we get later on to the other parts, we can worry about those things. So again, the reason why I like to break my tasks up into multiple steps is that it allows me then to just focus on one thing at any given time. So I can really kind of dedicate my time to trying to figure it out. If I'm trying to solve too many things at once, that can be really tricky because you're having to hold a lot of ideas in your head, or a lot of things, you end up having too many things up in the air, and that can get really tricky. So we have these sort of supports sticking all the way up, and I'm going to refer back to my reference image to see how they're kind of put together. And the way that they're kind of put together from the references is they're really just this sort of timber planks or beams that have been cut. And what's kind of interesting about these guys is that they sit on top of a series of other sort of horizontal beams and kind of run across that stabilize it. And that can give us a bit of some texture to work with. These beams will come off. Maybe we don't want this as sort of blocky. Maybe we want it a little bit, from references it looks like it tapers into a tip. So it might come down, there might be a section down here, because it looks like this sort of support area sits above the main roof. But let's get our other parts up and running first. Again, a nice thing about having this space is don't have to worry too much about the perspective. It's already done. I just have to focus on making sure that things line up, things go where they're supposed to be going, and we get the right forms and shapes that we're looking for. That's probably the most important thing. It's really good. It's obviously without having to really having to say it, but for obvious reasons, perspective is really, really important. But that importance that perspective provides, its job is just like I keep talking about. It's about clarity. How clear can you make your audience understand what they're looking at? Perspective is one of the tools that we use. The better perspective, the clearer, or at least the easier it is for your audience to understand what they're looking at. We want to think about perspective as a language. Right? So you want to make sure that you're speaking the same language as your audience. Because there's no, the biggest difference, let's say, between like a young kid in high school, drawing something in math class or something like that, the biggest difference between that kid and the professional in terms of ideas often is not much. Right? We're pretty creative when we're young. It's only as we get a little bit older we kind of, wouldn't say we lose that creativity, but that creativity kind of atrophies a little bit. So the only difference between those two guys at the end is not really the idea, but it's the execution, the ability of the artist, of the more experienced artist, of the professional. The advantage that they have is that they are able to put things in perspective. And as a result, they're more able to communicate their idea across to an audience. That's really what it means. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of design refinement with a working professional or with someone who's a little bit older than a high school kid, just from the dint of having a little bit more of a little bit more lived experience. But there are drawings online from little kids that as young as 5 that have some really cool ideas to them. And what separates that stuff out from professional work is that ability to communicate an idea across. If you have a look at something like Star Wars has in
terms of design, Star Wars is very sort of simple. When I say simple, it's very geometric. It's got these very nice sort of bold shapes. It doesn't have too many complicated things to it. And I think that's probably, in my opinion, that's why it works so well as toys, as things geared towards kids, because you have this thing that is so easy to understand. Right? And because it's so easy to understand, it's really easy for people to recognize, oh, this is meant to be the bad guy, this is meant to be the good guy, and so on. So that stuff is always really useful. So I've kind of established the main roof. I want to keep this part a little bit bare. I don't want the stocks over here kind of getting involved here, because I want to put some form of signage over here. I think in our original design, we had some form of signage over here. So I don't want this end to get too cluttered. I can, of course, always go in and add it in. I've got the base already there, so it's not too much of a bother. So if we pull this back, that should be about there. And we want to think about the type of roof that this is going to have. So again, I'm looking back at my reference images. Now, when I designed this, I kept it relatively, simple as just this sort of form. But now I'm looking at my references and trying to think, okay, well, what could I use? I found this very nice, sort of very thin looking roof. It's got a nice curve to it, very, very subtle curve. It's got these little supports running down on either end, support running through there, and it's really just made out of little shingles. I'm not going to do the whole thing. I just need to remind, later on, to remind myself that this thing is made out of shingles, so I don't put anything else in there to interfere. I might place a beam above just to kind of bookend it a little bit more. Always remember to save your work, just in case something catastrophic happens and you lose it. Try and get in the habit of saving your work, every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that. Putting a little sort of vertical supports, just help break up this surface, and again reinforcing a little bit of that large, medium, and small. Now, since if I close this and we jump back and look at this, we have this sort of nice pattern going through with our stable. We can try and mimic a little bit of that with our archery section as well. So that way we get a sense of continuity. In this case, I don't actually want it to go all the way to the top. So it just goes to the side here, just so I can break the surface up a little. Looking back at my original design, I have these very long support beams that are going to be coming out. So we're going to go ahead and put those in. One more at the bottom over here. And we should be able to match these, right? You can see how, again, let me beef this up. And you can see when I did my original construction, I kind of plotted them in with a rough idea of where I wanted things to be. Now, when we're doing our rough plotting, we don't need to have everything in there. Just a rough idea is more than good enough. We want the perspective there to help guide us, but we definitely don't want that perspective to run into a position where it's dictating to us how the design should look.
we should be free to design how we please, and then we use perspective as a way to help reinforce our design, not the other way around. And this is where 3D can be really detrimental to beginner artists, because in 3D you can do so many things, and you don't have to be afraid of perspective because it does perspective for you, right? All the stuff is done. But with 3D, with the ease of 3D, it also brings about a little bit of, let's say, fear, a little bit of hesitation in that. If you're so used to using 3D, you're so used to having everything perfect, you're less inclined then to want to go explore and play with different shapes. So you want to get into that mindset where your drawing, your desires, or what you want that design to be has to come first. And the 3D is there only to support. If you're too reliant on 3D and you don't break away from it, then you'll find that your designs are always going to look very three-dimensional. Again, 3D is just a tool that we use, right? It shouldn't be used to dictate our designs. If we're starting to be dictated by the 3D tools that we have, then it's probably a good sign to stop and reassess. So in keeping also with our stables, I'm going to put a little sort of window here. Now that center line runs there, so that means that my window is going to be about there. So very simple window. You can put a little bit of, again, just like the doors that we had, we can design these windows to be kind of with these paper strips down them. So again, it allows it, it gets the feeling of opening up some of this space, because we can certainly purposely open some of this by having, let's say, some of these strands get caught behind the windowsill, and that way we can hint as to what's inside. We don't even really need to hint at what's inside. We just need to show that there is an inside to this structure. So that's my surface. Let's continue and have a look at this. So in this case, maybe I want to cut this entire section out, and I want to place this as an enclosed element. I want to slightly offset. The reason why I'm thinking about making this a little bit offset is that from a quarter angle view, I want some distinct entrance that we can see when you, let's say, if you create a unit, I want to be able to see the units come out, right? In fact, I'm gonna put these guys a little bit behind, so there's a little overhang from the roof. So again, if we are looking at this from a quarter view, we get a little bit of a shadow there. Again, shadows are great. They really help anchor down a form, make it feel a lot more realistic. Very simple wooden sort of planks, and then up here we can keep this empty. Right? Again, that's going to allow us to show. So sections moving in. That perspective's not quite right to everything else. So maybe we see into another door back there. Let's just thicken out this line weight for ourselves so that when we are cleaning this up, we know what we're looking at. We wouldn't want to be cleaning this up and then not realizing or kind of starting to forget what we're actually trying to do. And then the corner of the house is going to sit somewhere there. So we are probably going to have that door edge is going to be there. And this is where we can start to put in. Now, since we have sort of a lot of this open, breezy sort of feel to it, it has a nice, I want these buildings to have a little bit of a softer feel. I don't want them to feel like kind of they're marshmallows, but I want this place to feel fairly airy. So we're going to go with sort of curtain doors, as at least to the main, to the foremost threshold of the structure. There might be stairs leading in. And then we never want to forget, this is something that a lot of people, including myself, we forget a lot, is light. Now, some games don't have a day-night cycle. Like most RTSs, generally from my recollection, I don't believe a lot of RTSs have a day-night cycle. But it's nice to have some lights. So let's say if you're on a different map, it's a darker map sort of thing, the lights can help a little bit in illuminating some of the elements of the building. Again, referring back to my design. So this is more, so when we think about archery, we think a lot about sort of fletching, using natural materials to bind things to create it. So with the walls, while I have sort of a bordered wall here, from the side here, I want something a little bit more elaborate. A bit more structure on the poles at least. And then let's say we keep to the same motif as our stable. But what we do with the wall here, the skirting board, is that we start to do very light sort of thatching on the side. And we break this up into sections. That might represent large, medium, and small. So we get a change in material in them. So it's not just all this sort of manufactured sort of sections. Just put in the skirting board. That'll just help ground some of these. Otherwise, these lines kind of just run down forever. It doesn't look as finished. It doesn't look as manufactured, because even though we're using a lot of natural material, in fact, all of this is natural materials in terms of timber, thatching, and all this stuff. But we do want to make it look like it's been manufactured. This stuff has been built. Right, so I've pre-plotted down these ellipses, right, using a grid to kind of knock them down. A nice quick way of doing it as a recap, if you've seen my other videos, you would have seen me do this before, is let's say this is our bounding box of where we want our ellipse to fit into. Right, nice easy way to do it is to create, let me go ahead and create a new layer, create a circle, stroke the guy, bring him around here, and then squeeze him to fit. Right, and we can go into skewer, and we just get, all we need to do is just get the corners to match. Right. It's not a perfect ellipse, it's not as accurate if you were to plot it by hand, but it's a quick way of creating an ellipse, right? Because in theory, my major and minor axes should line up pretty close. It's not going to be exact. It's a nice, quick and dirty way of doing it, but it just helps save a bit of time. Of course, nothing wrong with going in and plotting everything by hand. Here are my archery targets. Sitting on a frame. And they're going to obscure a little bit of that roof. make sure that these are all kind of aligned. They don't have to be aligned perfectly. One nice thing about working with natural materials is that they don't have to be perfectly straight, right? Because trees obviously don't grow 100% vertically up in a straight line. They have little knots and curves in them, so when you chop them down to make stuff, things that we make are going to have a little bit of those imperfections in there. That's what makes sort of natural things, like if you look at like furniture, really nice sort of wooden furniture, timber furniture, it's got this really nice feel to it. I'm going to drop these a little bit lower. Kind of fun, we can have little arrows sticking out along the ground. People have kind of missed. And then back here we can have bundles of hay or straw, and that's kind of again to represent in case if they miss, we don't want an arrow going through the wall. Might actually change this angle a little bit. Let's bring it back in line with the original roof. We may not be able to see it based on perspective on this end, but I purposely want to just cut a little bit out and kind of fudging around with the perspective a little bit, just so that we kind of break it out a little bit on the side here, so it just looks a little nicer. And so like I said, we use perspective as a language to help us understand things, but we don't want to be trapped by perspective. If there's something that we can do that may break perspective a little bit, but we feel that it's going to help sell an idea a little bit more, then as designers there should be nothing stopping us or holding us back from actually just doing that. Again, it's not 100% accurate, but our goal is not about accuracy. Our goal is about communication. We want to communicate a clear message across. We want to communicate an idea. And maybe back here we could, just for fun, again, last time I have this building over here, and we talked about this with the stables, about trying to link the two buildings together. So maybe back here I have a sort of a scarecrow dummy. Little sandbags holding it in place. Little things here as well. Yeah, think about that transition, right? That transition from our horizontal space into our vertical space. We want to make sure that there's a nice, smooth transition moving from one to the other rather than jarring. For sci-fi, it's a little bit different because you do get these very sharp edges. But even with sci-fi, you'll see that sometimes they'll chamfer the edge, put a 45 there, or they might put a grill there, or they might put sort of an ammo box or something just so that you don't get this very severe transition, this move from one shape to another. On this side, we could put maybe a sort of a destroyed target. It's kind of fallen apart. They haven't quite fixed it. Just on the other side, still has arrows stuck into it. Have a look at this little shrine thing. So again, I'm looking back at my reference images of the different types of architecture that I'm trying to pull from. It's not about making this thing 100% accurate, so a historian looking at this is going to be wowed. It's more about we're trying to capture the feel. Now, depending on what project you work at, sometimes the overall feel of it is going to be a lot more grounded. Sometimes the feel of it is going to be much more exaggerated, and it just really depends on what sort of project you end up working on. So, for example, let's say something like a title like Assassin's Creed is going to be a lot more grounded, just from the subject matter. But let's say if you work on, since we're talking about RTSs, let's say Command and Conquer, right? Yeah, the original Command and Conquer. Let's say they're remastering it now, I think, but let's say if they were to remake it, but send today, then you're looking at something that's a little bit more fantastic, a little bit crazier. Because you don't really want like a real world looking barracks, because it's kind of boring. It's just a couple of bungalows that can function as a barracks without any problems. So I put a curve on this to try and get that bow effect. But I think what I still want though is I want something a little bit softer, and I want to keep this thatched roof idea going, because I do think it's nice to have that that consistency. The only difference is we would make this particular thatch roof just a little smaller, right, relative to the scale. Still going to be quite fluffy though, given the scale of it. Building construction itself isn't going to change that much. I want to keep this a little simpler than what we might have for the stable, just because archery has a hunting quality to it, and because it's got that hunting quality to it, it feels a little bit more rustic. It feels a little bit more sort of farmerish, I guess. And so I want to still have, I want that sort of rustic feel to things. So I don't want it to be too refined. Back here, that's there, that should be the other post, should be back here. And of course in the middle here we have our target. Maybe in this one it's been hung up, almost like a gong or a bell. Now, I think we can make this a little bit more interesting. Let's bring the legs in so we still have some of these sort of friction joints. So let's bring these in so they sit a little bit closer inside.
create our plinth that's going to sit on. Again, see how easy it is just having a lot of these things kind of pre-plotted down. It just makes life so much easier. We can do it all in one go, like we can plot and draw and design and everything in one go, but it's very, very taxing. And if you're having to worry about too many things, it's very easy to have smaller things fall through the cracks. So my belief is always, it's at the end of the day, you're going to get much more out of it by just having the patience and doing it little bit by little bit than trying to rush through something. Now we're working in 2-point perspective right now. That means that it's really easy as well for me to pull my verticals. Later on, if we do want to change this to a 3-point perspective drawing, it's actually not that hard. We can kind of just tweak a little bit to give it a little bit of a 3-point look and feel. Again, it won't be precisely a 3-point perspective, very similar to kind of the same rationale behind our ellipse, but it'll be just enough that as far as communication goes, it's quite clear what we're going for. Again, our goal is clarity. How easy is it for people to look at our stuff and understand what they're looking at? If people are having a hard time, then we're not doing our job. So if you're designing, let's say, some characters and people don't know what those characters are, in terms of they don't know if it's a fast character, slow character, hero, or villain, you're in trouble. If you're designing a building and people don't really know what that building does, then you're in a bit of trouble. I mean, in real life, it's not like that, because in real life, any building can really function for any purpose. Most of the time, like an office building is pretty nondescript. There's nothing to, let's say, separate a office building, like a normal sort of suburban office building. There's nothing to separate it out from being a law firm or a biotech firm or an accounting firm or just a shop or a shady business front. There's nothing really to separate it out. But for entertainment purposes, we want to make sure that from the outside, scary place looks scary, friendly place looks friendly. Public buildings tend to follow that idea as well. So you see newer designs or older designs of courthouses and police stations are quite monolithic. They're designed to be intimidating. They're designed to show the citizenry the stability of law, so people feel safe. And the newer ones, the newer police stations that you see getting built, they tend to be a little bit more open, a little bit more friendly, and it's a reflection of what society views, that specific civil role is supposed to perform. So civic buildings, because they tend to have more of a symbolic meaning, get that treatment, but otherwise, what's the difference between, let's say, a normal suburban house and one that's being used to deal illicit drugs, or one that's being used as the next startup for some revolutionary technology? Right? There's nothing really to separate those out. The only thing at the end of the day that's going to separate them out is going to be what's on the inside, or what people do to it. But that's not really how entertainment works. We got to be able to see what's going on. So here's my first signage pole going up. I did want it on the other side. So I think what I'll do is I'm actually going to get rid of this particular middle section. Because I wanted that symmetry coming in. again, pre-measured, pre-subdivided structure underneath. It just helps make life so much easier. I've realized since with sort of teaching that with a lot of students, there's a tendency to want to make there's a tendency to equate good work with working hard, but also then equating or conflating working hard with just sort of time spent. So you end up with a lot of students who go, well, if I spend a lot of time on it, it must be good. But you then kind of look at what they've been spending time on and you realize, like, well, actually, you're spending time on really silly things. So you can say, like, well, my piece, I spent, let's say, 18 hours doing the plotting. But sure, you spend 18 hours doing the plotting, certainly no one's going to discount your dedication to your craft, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any good. Because if you're spending 18 hours, but if it's really crappy work at the end, it's still 18 hours of really crappy work. If you work a little bit smarter, even though let's say you only spend 10 hours doing something, you might be able to get something a little bit better. And also that time saved could be used to train other things. Now that's not a sort of invitation to just go nuts in terms of being as quick as you can, because there are some things that will just take more time. Line drawing, for example, will always take more time than a painting because you have to go in and explicitly show everything. You can't suggest anything. So it's a little bit tougher. I mean, don't get me wrong, painting has its own difficulties and challenges as well. But we have to be prepared that there's some things that we can speed up on, and there are some things that we can actually kind of cut down on in terms of time. But what's most important is that we don't ever want to conflate working hard with working long hours. Life is, this isn't fair, right? It's just because you work really hard and you spend a long time doing something doesn't automatically make it good. It's just one of those things. Kind of fun to have, errant arrows stuck everywhere from very bad archers trying to learn. Now I'm thinking of having a banner here just to mirror the stable that we had before, but I think what might work a little bit better is using a couple of these, extend this out a little bit, the support, and use it as a little flag. And we can do it for this guy as well. And keep these kind of squarish. So let's get a little bit longer. It blocks our window a little bit, so we're going to have to find another way to open up this space. And so this is a perfect opportunity with this large blank space here. So I'm just going to drop these sticks a little bit more, and sort of just to get the idea of arrows pointing up. Now I'm looking again back at my references and seeing if there are any sort of these openings on some of these roofs. Now it tends to be a little bit uncommon, but there are continuations of these in terms of there are roofs that kind of vary in the surface, so some of them kind of undulate a little bit. So there's nothing to say that we can't have a little bit of an undulation here.
let's keep to that triangle look, almost like an air vent. And so that way we can incorporate elements from over here. In this design. And getting this to almost look like an eye. So it almost acts as an icon, right? Because we tend to think archery is kind of long range and that sort of thing. Maybe alongside here we just have a couple of baskets. And they might have arrows and things in there. More elements here. There's a lot of really beautiful sort of rope work with sort of these Japanese shrines. We cool to kind of bring them in here. It adds a little bit of finery to the whole thing. Because if we put in things like, you know, very detailed filigree into the wood panel, we might not be able to see it because it doesn't cut into the overall shape, doesn't give like a nice silhouette. But if we can have things kind of being tied around and dangling down almost like garlands, then that can break the silhouette and create something that's a little bit more interesting. And we use some of this with our stable as well to mimic the reins of a horse. So here's our rough of our archery building, and then again we're going to follow the same process as the stable, and we're going to go through and then we're going to clean this up. Now I'm going to leave this for the time being, and I'm going to jump over and start working on the smith as well. And then once the smith is done, then we'll go through and we'll clean both of them up at the same time.
All right, so here we have the finished buildings. So we have our blacksmith over here, our archery building over here, and our stable or our cavalry building over here. So all I've done for these is I've flipped these two around just so that it sit a little bit better as a presentation. They should work whether it's left or right. But you can see here, all we've really done at this point is gone in, we've refined our drawings. I put in a little bit of sort of a number 3 value, very, very light gray on them so that we get a little bit more form, and as well a little bit of line weight just to help things pop a little. But at the end of the day, this is still a bit of a sketch finish, right? So this is a nice sort of relatively clean but rough finish. And again, all of this right now is about clarity. So this is when you might show this to your producer, to your team lead, or to your art director, and so on. And they might look at this and they might say, okay, well, let's make this a lot bigger, or let's make it smaller. Let's make the roof taller, or maybe smaller as well. So this allows them to make adjustments before we fully dive into a finished piece. And again, we can start to think, okay, maybe we need to add certain things here, take certain things away from here as well. But we can only do that. We can only make those decisions once this is done, right? These decisions in terms of taking this out maybe, or putting more in and so on, that only works if there's clarity in our design, there's clarity in our drawing. Without that clarity, it's very hard for us to make that decision. So again, this entire process is really, if we go back to it, we want to first set up our forms, right? That is the big blocks underneath. And then we want to start working on our scale, proportion, right? And all those things to start getting this in place. And then we also might factor in materials, so we know what certain things are going to be made out of. And then we're also thinking about transitions, right? So that transition from our horizontal space to our vertical space, we want that nice, easy transition, right? So tools, some dirt, grass, hay, all this sort of stuff helps that transition so our objects look like they are embedded into the ground as opposed to floating around. Right? And again, at the end of the day, all of this, and I keep repeating it because this is that important, it's about clarity. Clarity of design, clarity of purpose. We should be able to look at this and understand what the intent is. What does this building do? And that can be applied to all sorts of things. Is this vehicle going to be something run by heroes, or is it going to be used by villains? Is this character good or bad? What is this building? What does it do? Does it make things, or does it upgrade things? Is this where you can buy things, or is this where you can sell things? So again, it all comes down to, at this point, what we're looking at is, can we establish clarity of design and purpose? All right, guys. So I hope you've enjoyed part 2 of this particular demo. It's gone on for a little bit longer than our usual demos, but hopefully you'll be able to glean some information from this, and how you could take your own designs, right, your own small thumbnails, and take them into something a little bit larger, and eventually get into a spot where they're quite direct and they're quite clear with regards to the intent that you're after, with your own designs. All right, like I said, hope you guys enjoyed this demo. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys for the next demo for part 3.